Welcome, Fright fans, to the Horror Story Corner.
Where tonight we have a haunted Halloween special involving 5 forays into fright, penned entirely by artificial intelligence. Will they send us to the precipice of madness, where twilight kisses death in a macabre, eternal embrace, I hear you ask? Well, listen on. They'll certainly deliver you to the Horror Story Corner, if nothing else. This first terror tale involves creepy crawlies that have grown and multiplied until they burst forth to devour our very souls. I call it ants. In the sleepy town of Oak Haven, something sinister was stirring. Beneath the manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks, a nest of ants was growing. At first the townspeople paid them little heed. Ants were a common nuisance after all, but as the nest grew larger and more aggressive, the townspeople began to worry. The ants started by swarming over gardens and picnics, stealing food and biting anyone who got in their way. Then they began to invade homes and businesses, searching for more food and nesting space. The townspeople tried everything they could to get rid of the ants, but nothing worked. One night, a young girl named Sarah was awakened by a strange noise. She sat up in bed and saw ants crawling all over her room. She screamed and ran to her parents' room, but they were already covered in ants. Sarah's parents tried to fight them off, but they were outnumbered. Sarah watched in horror as her parents were devoured by the ants. She knew that she had to escape. She ran out of her house and into the night. The ants were everywhere, but Sarah managed to outrun them. She ran into the woods and hid behind a tree. Sarah stayed hidden in the woods for days, too afraid to go back to town. She watched from afar as the ants took over Oak Haven. They swarmed over the town, devouring everything in their path. People tried to fight back, but they were no match for the ants. One day, Sarah saw a group of soldiers coming towards Oak Haven. The soldiers were heavily armed and had gas masks on. They were determined to exterminate the ants. The soldiers entered Oak Haven and began to gas the town. The ants tried to fight back, but they were no match for the gas. The ants were killed in droves. Sarah watched as the soldiers cleared Oak Haven of ants. She was relieved that they were gone, but she was also saddened by the destruction that they had caused. Oak Haven was a ghost town. The streets were empty and the buildings were in ruins. Sarah was the only survivor of the ant attack. She wandered through the ruins of Oak Haven, alone and afraid. She knew that she could never go back to the town she had once known. She was now a stranger in a strange land. Sarah walked away from Oak Haven, vowing to never forget the horror that she had witnessed. She knew that the ants were gone, but she also knew that they could return at any time. Our second terror tale concerns something there, but just beyond the very corners of our eyes. I call it out of sight. In the quiet town of Everwood, there lived a monster that always stood just out of sight. It was a creature of shadow and smoke, with long, spindly limbs and a gaping maw, filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. Its eyes glowed with an eerie red light, and its whispers could be heard on the wind on moonless nights. The townspeople knew of the monster, but they had never seen it clearly. It was always one step ahead of them, always, just out of reach. One night, a young girl named Emily was walking home from school. When she heard a noise behind her, she turned around, but there was nothing there. She continued walking, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Emily quickened her pace, but the noise followed her. She could hear the monster's footsteps getting closer and closer. She ran as fast as she could, but the monster was faster. Emily reached her house and fumbled for her keys. She unlocked the door and burst inside. She slammed the door shut and locked it behind her. She leaned against the door, catching her breath. Emily was safe, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the monster was still outside, still waiting for her. The next day, Emily told her parents about the monster. They didn't believe her at first, but eventually they agreed to let her stay home from school. Emily spent the day in her room, but she couldn't relax. She kept thinking about the monster. She kept hearing its footsteps in her head. That night, Emily was awakened by a noise. She opened her eyes and saw the monster standing in the corner of her room. It was even more terrifying than she had imagined. The monster raised its hand and pointed at Emily, its mouth open wide, and it let out a blood-curdling scream. Emily screamed too. She tried to run, but the monster was too fast. It grabbed her and dragged her out of the room. Emily's parents were awakened by the screams. They ran into Emily's room, but she was gone. The next morning, the townspeople searched for Emily, but they couldn't find her. She was gone without a trace. The townspeople knew that the monster had taken Emily. They lived in fear of the monster, always knowing that it was out there, waiting for its next victim. The monster still stands just out of sight, watching and waiting. It is a creature of darkness and fear, and it will always be there, haunting the town of Everwood.
Our third tale involves the devil himself, and a simple proposition. I call it, sell your soul for seeds, sir.
In the small town of Willowbrook, there lived a man named Jacob. He was a kind and hard-working man, but he was also very poor. He had a wife and 2 young children, and he struggled to provide for them. One day, Jacob was walking through the woods when he came across a strange old man. The old man was dressed in black, and he had a long white beard. He was holding a sack in his hand. "Hello, Jacob," the old man said. "I've been waiting for you." Jacob was surprised. "How do you know my name?" he asked. "I know a lot of things," the old man said. "I know that you're a good man and that you're struggling to provide for your family, but I can help you with that." The old man opened the sack and showed Jacob the seeds inside. "These are magic seeds," he said. "If you plant them, they will grow into the most delicious and nutritious crops you've ever seen. You'll be able to sell the crops and make lots of money." Jacob was tempted. He knew that if he planted the seeds, he could solve all of his problems. But he was also hesitant. He didn't know who the old man was, and he didn't trust him. "What do you want in return?" Jacob asked. The old man smiled. "I don't want much," he said. "Just your soul." Jacob gasped. "My soul?" he said. "But that's impossible." "Nothing's impossible for me," the old man said. "Do you want the seeds or not?" Jacob thought for a moment. He knew that he was making a deal with the devil, but he was desperate. He needed the money to provide for his family. "I'll take the seeds," Jacob said. The old man handed Jacob the sack of seeds. "Plant them carefully," he said, "and remember, I'll be coming back to collect my payment." Jacob planted the seeds, and they grew into the most beautiful crops he had ever seen. He sold the crops and made a lot of money. He was finally able to provide for his family, and he was happy. But Jacob knew that his happiness wouldn't last. The devil was coming back for his soul. One night, the devil came to Jacob's house. He knocked on the door, and Jacob answered it. "It's time to pay up, Jacob," the devil said. Jacob knew that he couldn't escape. He had made a deal with the devil, and now he had to pay the price. "I'm ready," Jacob said. The devil took Jacob's soul, and Jacob was never seen again. The people of Willowbrook were saddened by Jacob's disappearance, but they knew that he had made a deal with the devil. They warned each other about the old man in the woods, and they never went near him. But the devil is always out there, waiting for his next victim. He's waiting for someone who is desperate, someone who is willing to sell their soul for anything. So if you ever see a strange old man in the woods offering you magic seeds, don't take them. He's the devil, and he's coming for your soul.
Our fourth tale is very Halloweeny and simply called Pumpkin. In the quaint town of Pumpkinville, where the autumn leaves turned vibrant shades of orange and red, and the air was crisp with the scent of pumpkin spice, a sinister secret lurked beneath the surface. On the outskirts of town, in a secluded patch of woods, stood a pumpkin patch unlike any other. The pumpkins here were larger, more menacing, with twisted vines that writhed and coiled like serpents. The townspeople whispered tales of a murderous pumpkin that haunted the patch, a creature possessed by an evil spirit, but few dared to venture near to find out if the rumours were true. On a fateful Halloween night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the pumpkin patch. They had heard the stories, but they didn't believe them. They thought it would be fun to scare each other. The teenagers entered the patch, laughing and joking. But as they ventured deeper, the air grew colder and the shadows seemed to dance around them. Suddenly, a pumpkin rolled out of the darkness and struck one of the teenagers in the leg. The teenager cried out in pain and fell to the ground. The other teenagers rushed to his side, but before they could help him, a horde of pumpkins emerged from the shadows. The pumpkins surrounded the teenagers, their eyes glowing with an eerie green light. The teenagers screamed in terror as the pumpkins attacked. Their vines wrapped around their legs and pulled them to the ground. The pumpkins' sharp teeth tore at their flesh. One by one, the teenagers were dragged away into the darkness, their screams echoing through the night. But no one came to help. The next morning, the townspeople searched for the missing teenagers, but they could find no trace of them. All that remained was a single pumpkin stained with blood. The townspeople knew that the murderous pumpkin had claimed its victims. They boarded up the pumpkin patch and vowed to never enter it again. But the evil that lurked within the pumpkin patch remained, dormant, waiting for the next unsuspecting victims to wander into its clutches. So, if you ever find yourself in Pumpkinville on Halloween night, beware of the murderous pumpkin. It's still out there, waiting for its next meal. Finally, our fright-filled fifth tale is entitled Asylum. On a dark and stormy Halloween night, a group of teenagers gathered at the edge of an abandoned asylum. They had heard rumors that the asylum was haunted, and they were determined to see if the stories were true. They entered the asylum through a broken window. The air inside was cold and damp, and the only light came from the flashlights on their phones.
The teenagers explored the asylum, room by room. They found empty beds, rusted wheelchairs, and medical equipment covered in dust. Suddenly, they heard a noise coming from one of the rooms. They crept towards the room, their hearts pounding in their chests. They opened the door and peered inside. It was dark, but they could see a figure standing in the corner. The figure was tall and thin, with pale skin and long, dark hair. The teenagers gasped in horror. It was a ghost. The ghost turned to face the teenagers. Its eyes were empty and black. It opened its mouth and let out a blood-curdling scream. The teenagers turned and ran. They ran through the asylum, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. The ghost chased after them. It was faster than they were. One by one, the ghost caught up to the teenagers. It dragged them back into the darkness, never to be seen again. The following morning, the townspeople searched for the missing teenagers, but they could find no trace of them. All that remained was a trail of blood leading back to the abandoned asylum. The townspeople knew that the ghost had taken the teenagers. They boarded up the asylum and vowed to never enter it again. But the ghost still haunts the asylum to this day. It waits for its next victims, unsuspecting teenagers who wander into its clutches on Halloween night.
Well, wasn't that an interesting delve into the corner? It'll be interesting to see how AI develops. Perhaps it will truly help us to achieve wonders before it ultimately drags us kicking and screaming to the horror story corner. Thank you for listening, and as ever, enter sleep mode.